Hello, Year 12, and this is the first video that is linking in with the specification that's asking us for caregiver-infant interaction. And I'm going to start it with a question. And we see the question at the bottom. It says, with reference to Abdul's conversation with his friend, outline two features of caregiver-infant interaction. And so therefore, immediately we know that we can look at the specification and we can see that we are looking for the two features. Now, what is quite simple in this particular context is that those features have been told to us by the specification. This is what it says: caregiver interactions in humans, reciprocity and interactional synchrony. So in other words, that's what this particular video is going to be about, looking at what is reciprocity and what is interactional synchrony. And so I'm not going to answer the question right now, but we can go back to the question and we can see, okay, so when we're reading through this particular scenario, we're going to find where there is reciprocity and where there is interactional synchrony. And we'll see a couple of things here. So proud father Abdul was talking to his friend as they're both watching Abdul's wife, Tasneen, interacting with their baby daughter, Aisha. It's amazing, really, said Abdul. Tasneen smiles, Aisha smiles back. Tasneen moves her head, Aisha moves hers perfectly in time with each other. Yes, agreed his friend. It's almost as if they are one person. Okay, so from that, we just need to find reciprocity and we need to find interactional synchrony. So let's go through the content as we have it, and hopefully we can kind of end with this question and we can see where it goes. So what we need to do is an introduction to this kind of human-infant interactions. And what we need to kind of start getting our heads around is this idea that from a very early age, babies are having meaningful social interactions with their carers. They're not just blobs. Okay, in fact, it's this is quite good for psychology because there was a long time in which babies and kind of childhood was kind of undervalued by society as if they weren't important. In fact, when we look at a topic later on in the course, when we look at kind of institutions where children are cared for, most people kind of felt that it was physical care that they needed and not emotional care. But now we're kind of opening up this idea that there's something meaningful about interactions with the people around them. And it has here an important function for the child's social development. So in other words, we don't just kind of leave babies floundering on the ground to look after themselves. We care for them, but also that there's this meaningful interaction. And in fact, we think that those interactions start a lot earlier than what we would have done normally. So obviously, at this particular stage, I hope you can appreciate that a child or baby's interactions are going to be non-verbal. Okay, and so therefore, at this particular stage, I'm not going to include it on this particular loom. I would like you to watch video 1. It's Dr. Andrew Metzoff talking about babies are born learning. You might not want to watch all of it, but you can quite clearly hear them kind of talking about kind of how babies are kind of open to kind of learning from the start. In fact, that's the amazing thing about a child. Their brain is kind of just open to forming as many of these kind of synapses that they can. And I would like you to watch video number 1 at that particular point. So when we see that babies are open to having these meaningful interactions, the first kind of phrase we need to look at is this phrase of reciprocity. Okay, now it says here it's a description of how two people interact. Okay, the mother-infant interaction is reciprocal in that both infant and mother respond to each other's signals. Okay, now I think in terms of social human beings, we're quite familiar with this idea of being reciprocal. If you walked into the room and I said, "Hey, John, how are you doing? You look amazing today. What have you been doing?" You might feel a bit embarrassed that I've kind of said something like that, and you might even feel that you need to reciprocate the compliment towards me, and therefore obviously a bit awkward. So first things first, we look at this idea of reciprocal. It says that the mother and infant interaction is reciprocal. mother and infant interaction is reciprocal. They both respond to each other. So once again, the baby is not just a blob doing their own thing. They are kind of looking and interacting with the mother, and the mother is looking and interacting with them. And if you ever kind of talk to somebody who's had a baby or who's been pregnant and then had a baby, you find that it's one of those social things where people kind of break the social barriers, where previously we would not interact with people. As soon as somebody has a baby, we tend to kind of talk to them about their baby. We kind of really kind of want to interact with them. And so to demonstrate kind of how the mother and the baby both kind of interact with each other, I'd like you to watch the second video. It's called the Still Face Experiment, and it's an amazing kind of researcher, but Tronick, who looks a lot of cross-cultural stuff, but he kind of wants to show kind of how desperate the baby's looking for interaction, but you can also kind of see in the mother's eyes and kind of the mother's behavior how difficult it is to not kind of reciprocate behavior to the 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 baby. So that's the second video I'd like you to watch. I'll put these links on the particular Google Classroom for you. There's been a lot of research on this, but he also noticed that the research isn't kind of from the 1960s or 1950s even. It's kind of quite recent here, where we kind of are beginning to understand kind of infant reactions a little bit different. And it says here that babies have periodic alert phases. So in other words, they need to sleep, they need to kind of, they are growing and all those types of things, but they have these alert phases, which kind of makes them want to signal that they're ready for interaction. So obviously babies don't have the capacity to say, "Oi, come and play with me." So they might kind of giggle or cry, or they might kind of just make a noise. That kind of we saw from the still face experiment, that kind of signal that the baby makes to say, "Hey, hang on, what's going on here?" And we can see that this happens. And it says the mother typically picks up and responds to the infant around 2/3 of the time. So it is possible that mothers, even attentive mothers, don't always notice that the baby is ready and alert. Okay, Feldman goes on to say that from about 3 months, it becomes more frequent. Okay, and of course what happens is the baby is vocalizing, not necessarily vocalizing in actual words, but actually just giving some kind of verbal signals and facial expressions, and it's both the mother and child initiate these interactions. So that's quite kind of interesting to me to see that it's not just the adult who's doing this particular behavior. Brazeldin, and these are names that obviously can be used in evaluation. Brotherton also says that there's a rhythm to this particular interaction. Now, this is kind of earlier research from 1979, and says that the caregiver anticipates the behavior and responds appropriately. So it's kind of like, oh yeah, she's usually sleepy after lunch, or no, this is her time when she wants to play, and things like that. You might have noticed this actually maybe with some of your pets, that they have a particular time frame when they're kind of particularly cheeky and want to play and things like that. So babies are kind of doing the same thing. And then another thing that Brasden does actually kind of talk about, and this is kind of picked up by other researchers and we'll see in explanations, it says sensitivity to the infant is a good component of attachment. So in other words, it's important for us to kind of recognize that if I always kind of don't notice that my child wants to interact with me, maybe my attachment is not going to be that good. So just to end reciprocity, I kind of want you just to make sure that you do understand exactly what it is. Okay, so to reciprocate, it says here that we respond to. Okay, so it's kind of like something that fits in. So if I was going to reciprocate something, I might actually figure it out. And so somebody gave me the suggestion that if you ever do any baking, this is kind of quite a reciprocal thing. So if you think that your recipe is perhaps a little bit too kind of watery, you might add something to it to make it less watery, and vice versa. Okay. I know certainly within a laboratory, this was quite important, that the kind of the nuance of kind of knowing kind of what kind of will work a little bit extra here, a little bit less there. And that's reciprocal. So something that's reciprocal is something which is potentially trying to feed off each other. You know, if you walk into a room and you say to your friend, "Oh, so how's it going?" and they go, "Oh, fine," and you go, "Oh, okay, that's that's not like them normally. There must be something wrong." If it is that it is their normal behavior, then we go, "Okay, fine, let's just do something else." So remember, reciprocity is about reciprocating our particular behavior. So hopefully there you got the first understanding of reciprocity. The second one is interactional synchrony. So it's obviously two words here. So maybe you're familiar with this idea of synchronized swimming. And we see that synchronized swimming, they kind of work at the same particular time. I'm under the impression it's quite a difficult sport. It's not necessarily a sport that I particularly like. But of course, we find that there's some kind of coordinated rhythmic exchanges when people are synchronizing themselves. So we're kind of looking to each other, making sure we're in line, we're doing the same behavior, we're feeding off the timing with each other. And that's what synchrony is, kind of doing what the other person has or that the other person is. Okay? And you often find that children or babies will often kind of just kind of mimic. I suppose that's quite a key word here, mimic. That when you are in sync with somebody else, you're mimicking what they're doing. And I know you could argue, well, this is reciprocal, that they wouldn't have done it if they hadn't have seen you. But it's kind of, they are going to be quite similar. But we find that reciprocity is about kind of noticing that somebody's doing something and responding to it, where synchrony is kind of just simply doing what other people do. And there's and Feldman kind of goes on to say this is the coordination of micro level social behavior. You know, so things like, I mean, just odd things like if a person is making particular facial expressions, the baby copies it. And it, of course, mimicking and copying, quite important type idea. And this leads us on to very famous research. And this is a picture of that particular research. And what we have here is an adult with 3 different facial expressions. And what we find was when they've video recorded the particular people making these expressions, we find that the babies kind of ended up kind of synchronizing with the adult and doing the same type of thing each time. And so that study is something which you can use for interaction or synchrony. It's clearly also research support because there are people who've done research who've kind of found that this is a particular case. And they said that infants as young as 2 weeks old displayed one of 3 facial expressions or one of 3 distinctive gestures. So we've seen the facial expressions there. So in other words, babies were doing what the adults were doing. So we know that they also filmed this and that it was an independent person who was able to kind of identify that babies were doing exactly this. So it says that there was an association between the expression and the gesture of the babies. There's an association between the expression and the action of the babies. Okay, so in other words, the babies were doing what the adults were doing. So I know I haven't gone into too much detail of interactional synchrony. I do feel that you should kind of go back to the word again. So we see here that synchrony, or to be in sync with somebody, is simultaneous action. Simultaneous action. Okay, it says the state of operating or developing according to the same time. Okay, and so the example is often maybe, for example, your phone. Many of you might have synced it with the cloud. It's one of the amazing things that I do like about modern technology, and certainly I'm sure this is possible within Google, but certainly one of the reasons I quite like Apple is that if for any reason my phone had to just die on me, I can go to an Apple store or I can buy it online and I can have my new phone kind of updated to exactly what my old phone was like within actually a very short period of time. And my contacts, my apps, even the data, some of the games I've been playing, and all of those types of things. Kind of this idea that your device, as it stands now, is syncing with the cloud periodically, so that the two are the same. Okay, so there we go. We have those two concepts. I do have some evaluation points, mostly because we haven't had this section kind of before in the specification, and so I would like to kind of think that if we had to write an essay, we could. And I suppose the biggest kind of concerns we have about this is that the research is limited. It says here the research is limited because what we can observe is that babies do this, but what we can't observe is the purpose, the reason behind babies doing this. And so, for example, Feldman says here that synchrony and reciprocity, you could argue, it says simply describes the behavior. So therefore, there are limitations here in terms of what is the purpose of this particular kind of idea of caregiver-infant interactions. And we also know that we can reliably do this. Obviously, we know that the Feldman research, Metcalf research, sorry, was recorded, but it's not necessarily useful. And so we do have a concern there. So that's one of my evaluation points. I do have a however for this, and I really like this researcher by Isabella. And in fact, some of the textbooks kind of deal with her in much more detail. And she was looking into caregiver-infant interactions, and she studied 30 mothers and infants, and how much the degree of synchrony, so how in sync they really were. And what was interesting was that she discovered that the quality of the first attachment was linked to the quality of the synchrony. So it says here they found that high levels of synchrony were associated with better quality mother-infant interaction. So maybe even though we don't know the purpose of it, we can see how potentially the more attentive, the more in sync somebody is, the more likely they are to have a strong attachment. And so please kind of remember that Isabella kind of research there. Looking specifically at the research, the Metcalf and Moore research, there are a concern, it's a weakness, of course, that we can't replicate the research. So Kopka tried to replicate it, and unfortunately, they were unable to do this. And so this is a problem because it could mean that the theory or understanding of interactional synchrony and reciprocity is flawed because we can't find other people doing it. Now, I know that that particular research, unfortunately, had less control than the original research, and there were also potential errors in the procedure. And so we can kind of argue that their research didn't actually replicate Metcalf and Moore in any particular way. But maybe this is kind of what we kind of need to get to. It says here, the difficulty in making controlled observations of mother-infant interactions. And of course, we're working with babies, okay? So babies are difficult. They don't do what we want to do. In fact, if you do have a younger brother or sister, or kind of have a family member or something that does have a little baby, you kind of often see that they typically or stereotypically kind of don't do what they're meant to do. And often that's kind of the problem with trying to research them. And so whenever we are looking at this type of research, we need to consider the research methods. And there are lots of problems with this, okay? Lots of problems with researching babies. And so can we reliably test this infant behavior? So it says infants frequently use the facial expressions that are used in the test. So in other words, they do the things like opening the mouths or sticking out their tongues. And so, of course, we can't distinguish between general activity and specific behavior. So in other words, any of the findings that I might have ultimately may be flawed. But of course, there's a however to this. We find that most of this type of behavior is well controlled because we typically do record the behavior. And we also find that we can analyze this particular data later. but it doesn't mean that those difficulties automatically go away. It just means that we can do research. It doesn't mean that we can actually take much from the research. And then the last point, it is a furthermore point, so we could end at the previous bit. And this is a good thing, and I love this about babies. They don't know or care that they're being observed. Now kind of go back to the research methods on observations, and we see in terms of demand characteristics, it's often the mother that has demand characteristics, but babies and toddlers really don't care. In fact, you find this, this is for a couple of years, that young children kind of will say and do things that may not be expected because they just simply, they don't understand kind of this idea of being guarded or any of those types of things. So there we have it. We have this understanding that researching babies is difficult, but also quite good because of the demand characteristics that they don't have. And so, of course, any research may well be valid. It's maybe the mother that we have to question in terms of this. Okay. Now, I know that these research, these points are there for any extended writing. The chances are that we may not use them. And if we actually look at this particular question, kind of coming back to this question, we don't need to go into any detail of the research support or evaluation points. It just says, with reference to the conversation, kind of outline two features. So one of the features we have to do is reciprocity. Okay, so what it means outline, we need to explain what it is. And then we need to give our example. Okay, so reciprocity, so I do something, they respond to it. And so I personally think it's this idea where it says Tasneem smiles and Aisha smiles back. Okay, so we see that one person does one thing and then the other person responds to it. The next one is synchrony. Okay, and of course we have to do the same thing where we have to explain it, and then we go to look at the example. Okay, now I think there are two things that you could do. One is Tasneem moves her head, Aisha moves hers perfectly in time with each other. Quite like that phrase, perfectly in time with each other. Or of course, you could say almost as if they're one person. Okay, now what's important here is that we're just kind of going to the theory where we are writing and explaining about reciprocity and interactional synchrony. That's where the credit in this particular question comes. And then we're going on to refer to the example and justifying why it is there. So for example, when Aisha smiles back at Tasneem, we can say it's reciprocal because she's kind of feeding off the mother's smile and kind of she's doing it the same. If I'm doing perfectly in time with each other, in other words, she's mimicking the behavior, she's acting like the other person, or if it's almost as if they're one person, she's mimicking once again, doing what the other person does. So therefore it's interactional synchrony. So there we go. That's all we need to do for this. I just want to show you a few other questions that have come up in the exam. It says describe one way in which psychologists have investigated. So this is either describing the Isabella study or the Metcalfe and Moore is probably the best one here. And then it says evaluate the way of investigating. So those points are made about research methods. It's quite important for us to have a look at. It says there, do not refer to ethical issues in your answers, because actually you saw from that still face experiments that potentially we don't need to worry about that because the mother is there kind of giving consent for the baby. Okay. And then the last one comes from June 2017. It says, what is meant by reciprocity? Okay, and then evaluate research. So they seem to like this idea of evaluating research. And this particular one is just telling you what it is. And you see that's worth 6 marks. Okay, so that's an actual grade change in a particular exam. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this, and this is certainly a kind of a new topic for us to do. If you have any questions, please do email me, and we continue working through this. Thank you very much.